One morning in the late 1990s, 38-year-old Sandy McKinnon hurried around her small apartment in Boston, Massachusetts, getting ready for work. She wiggled her feet into her shoes while buttoning her pants, then raced into the bathroom to do something with her hair. She looked in the mirror and sighed. Her bangs and shoulder-length hair were more tangled than she thought. She'd just bought a satin pillowcase to try to keep her hair smooth while she slept, but apparently it was not working. She got her brush out of the drawer and began to comb her hair. And as she did this, she accidentally brushed against her scalp. And as she did, she winced. A sharp burning pain spread over the right side of her head. Confused, she parted her hair to get a good look at her scalp in the mirror. And she could see blisters right there on her head. She lifted her bangs up, and she saw the blisters extended all the way across her forehead. But as alarming as this was, Sandy thought she knew what these could be. A few years ago, she'd had a case of shingles, which caused a painful rash of red blisters, and so she wondered if maybe her shingles infection had returned. It's rare for someone as young as Sandy to get shingles, but her circumstances were special. Sandy was coming out of a difficult few years. 5 years ago, Sandy was a professional psychologist and the proud mother of 2 children. But then a painful divorce set her on a path of self-destruction. She started drinking, and then her new boyfriend got her into heroin because it helped her cope with the pain of her family splintering apart. Eventually, because of the way Sandy was living her life, she completely lost visitation rights with her kids, and then she hit rock bottom when she contracted HIV from a contaminated needle. This was a devastating wake-up call, and was the push Sandy needed to leave her boyfriend and her drug habit behind. Sandy had been clean for the last 2 years and was slowly rebuilding her life. But she would always be HIV positive, and so she had to be careful. She had a weakened immune system, which is why she suffered a shingles outbreak in the first place. And so, standing there looking in the mirror at these awful new blisters, Sandy decided she would call her doctor the second she got to work, just to make sure these blisters were not a sign of anything more serious. A few days later, Sandy was running around her house again, microwaving oatmeal while pouring herself a cup of coffee. She grabbed a pill bottle from beside the coffee maker, opened it up, coaxed out a tablet, and then drank it down with a glass of water. It was the antiviral medication that her physician, Dr. John Douglas, had prescribed for her blisters. Dr. Douglas had confirmed that Sandy's rash was indeed another episode of shingles, and he told her she'd feel better in a few days with this medication. Sandy took her coffee into the bathroom and set it on the sink, and then inspected her head in the mirror. The blisters were already fading, which was a huge relief. And that sharp stab of pain she had felt right when the comb had touched her scalp that first time had subsided. But there was one weird new thing. The stabbing pain had been replaced by a persistent itch in her head that Sandy just could not seem to scratch. The previous night, she'd sat in front of the TV and put a bag of frozen peas right on her head, hoping that would numb the itch and make it go away. But it didn't. And now this morning, it was still there. And so Sandy grabbed her hairbrush and began combing her hair, but as she did, she intentionally applied more pressure to try to scratch this phantom itch. And the bristles felt so good on her scalp as she did this that she lost track of time. When Sandy finally realized what time it was, she jumped. She had to go or she'd be late to work for the second time this week. Since getting clean, Sandy really prided herself on punctuality. And so despite wanting to keep trying to itch her scalp, she tossed the brush down and got going. But several days later, the itch in Sandy's head was so bad that Sandy decided to go back to Dr. Douglas's office. When she got there, Dr. Douglas parted Sandy's hair to get a better look at her scalp, while Sandy explained that when she first started taking the shingles medication, her itch had been ongoing but low grade. She could live with it. But over the last few days, the itch had changed. Now it wasn't like her scalp was itching, it was like the itch was coming from inside of her head. And so no matter how hard she tried to scratch at this thing, the burning, tingling itch would not go away. It was driving her insane. Dr. Douglas told her that itching was actually a very common symptom for all kinds of skin conditions. An allergic reaction, bacterial or fungal infection, psoriasis, sun damage, even dry skin. All of them can cause a chronic need to scratch. But Dr. Douglas told Sandy that beyond the fading shingles blisters on her head, he wasn't seeing anything abnormal on her scalp. So he wanted to try a medicated cream to try to soothe the itch, and take care of any topical skin conditions that might be forming before the problem got any worse. A few weeks later, Sandy woke up a little bit before dawn. Her room was still dark, so she rolled over to go back to sleep. But her cheek landed on something that felt wet and strange. Confused, she turned on her bedside lamp and gasped in horror. Blood and hunks of hair lay scattered across her pillowcase. She instinctively reached for her head, and she felt something sticky right at the itchy spot just above her right temple. Horrified, she jumped out of bed and ran to her bathroom mirror. The itchy patch was bleeding, and the hair around that area was noticeably thin, which explained the hunks of hair on her pillow. And on top of all that, her head still itched. In fact, the itch had only gotten worse over the past few weeks, despite the medicated cream that Dr. Douglas had prescribed her. Though it was difficult, she was able to resist scratching her scalp when she was awake. But now it seemed like, in her sleep, she had somehow scratched her scalp into a bloody mess and ripped her own hair out. The very idea of her doing that made her nauseous. A few hours later, Sandy was back inside of Dr. Douglas's office, now awaiting the results of something called a viral load test, which measures the amount of HIV in the blood. Dr. Douglas was concerned that this itch she was having was a sign that her HIV could be getting worse. Dr. Douglas walked into the exam room and set his clipboard on the desk. He told Sandy that there was some good news. Her HIV was actually inactive and showed no signs of progressing. So whatever was causing this itch very likely had nothing to do with her HIV. Dr. Douglas had also ordered additional blood tests and x-rays, but those had also come back normal. Sandy felt a weight lift off her shoulders, but it was short-lived, because then Dr. Douglas delivered his diagnosis. He suspected that Sandy's itch might actually be a symptom of a psychiatric condition instead of a physical ailment. He thought she might have a condition called trichotillomania. It's an obsessive-compulsive disorder in which patients have an irresistible urge to pull their own hair out. Obsessive-compulsive disorder, or OCD for short, is when someone has unreasonable thoughts or obsessions that can lead to compulsive behavior. And so they were suggesting that Sandy had a version of that. Sandy was immediately skeptical. She told Dr. Douglas that she didn't actually have the urge to pull her hair out. She just had an itchy scalp. But Dr. Douglas still wanted to try treating her for trichotillomania. And so he prescribed her antidepressants that were used to treat obsessive-compulsive disorder. And hopefully, they would help her manage the urge to itch. Sandy still felt very unsure about this, but at this point, she was willing to try anything to save her scalp. 3 weeks later, when Sandy's alarm clock went off, she felt awful and groggy, and she slammed her hand down on it to make it quiet, and then she sat up to get out of bed, and as she did, she felt thick liquid running down her face. At first, she was worried it might be blood, and so instinctively she wiped it off her face to check. But when she looked at her hand, it was not a red, viscous liquid. It was pale green and runny. And so she went to check her itchy spot in the bathroom mirror, but when she looked, all she could see was all this gunk on her scalp, and it terrified her. Sandy grabbed some gauze from her medicine cabinet and dabbed it gently on her scalp, trying to absorb some of the greenish goo. Then she picked up the phone and called Dr. Douglas, and thankfully, he was free for an immediate appointment. Once Sandy got to his office, Dr. Douglas inspected her scalp with a flashlight. Sandy could feel him pressing around the itchy spot with gloved fingers. And then at some point, he clicked off the flashlight and promptly told Sandy that he was calling an ambulance, and then he hurried out to get her charts updated before she could ask any questions. An hour later, Sandy was in the hospital with emergency room doctors and nurses crowded all around her, prepping her for emergency surgery. Sandy was so scared, she thought she might have a heart attack. She asked one of the doctors what was going on. He looked up from what he was doing and gave Sandy an alarmingly blunt answer. He explained that she clearly had been scratching her scalp in her sleep, so much so that the raw tissue had grown infected, and that infection had softened her skull bone enough that Sandy had scratched all the way through it during the night, and she'd managed to now scratch into her brain. The greenish goo was infected cerebrospinal fluid, the doctor said. That is the liquid that cushions and protects the brain. Now they were worried that Sandy's scalp infection could reach her brain, and so they had to get her to the operating room before Sandy suffered extensive and lasting brain damage. Later that afternoon, Sandy felt lightheaded and bleary-eyed as she woke up and looked around her hospital room. The trauma of her morning came rushing back to her, and so instinctively she patted the top of her head, and she found it was wrapped in layers of gauze. Then she noticed her thigh was bandaged too. She wondered if she banged up her leg somehow. Just then, a doctor appeared at the doorway and came to her bedside. He first asked Sandy how she was feeling, and Sandy said she was really just confused and didn't know what was going on. And then the doctor explained what had just happened. They told her that a neurosurgeon had washed out Sandy's wound on her head and removed all the damaged tissue. Then a plastic surgeon had covered the wound with a graft of skin from her thigh. The entire procedure had gone well. Sandy just needed to give her body time to heal. Sandy was shocked, but thanked the doctor, and then closed her eyes, enjoying the warm, cozy hug of anesthesia. But a few minutes later, as the anesthetic began to wear off, a tiny little itch began to simmer beneath her bandages on her head, growing sharper and wider until it was almost unbearable. Sandy gripped either side of her hospital bed, fighting the urge to scratch. She pressed the call button and then gritted her teeth until a nurse came into the room. Sandy explained the problem and pleaded for more anesthetic to curb this itch, or anything really, just to keep her from scratching her scalp. The nurse promised to see what she could do, but warned Sandy they couldn't just give out anesthetic as a painkiller. They'd have to find another way to help her. Almost a week later, a new doctor stood at Sandy's bedside. He introduced himself to her as Dr. Baker, a member of the hospital's psychiatric team. Sandy knew why he'd been called to see her. She had awoken in the hospital bed with blood covering her pillow. She'd scratched all the way through her new skin graft. So they'd taken her into surgery to give her a second one. And so now she had bandages not just on her head and right thigh, but also on her left thigh, where they pulled the second skin graft from. But by this morning, she had scratched through the second skin graft as well. Even though the hospital was wrapping her hands in gauze every night before she went to sleep to prevent her from scratching through her skin grafts, while she was sleeping, she couldn't stop herself from scratching. She could resist the urge to scratch during the day, but she became a danger to herself the moment she fell asleep. It was like instinct was taking over. Dr. Baker knew all of this and gave Sandy an encouraging smile when he saw her, but he told her that he still agreed with Dr. Douglas. She must have some form of OCD. In Sandy's case, her compulsive behavior was scratching her head. Dr. Baker told Sandy that he wanted to interview her family about her habits prior to coming to the hospital. He also wanted to give Sandy a psychiatric evaluation to confirm her diagnosis. And in the meantime, he was going to start her on drugs that would make her feel groggy and help her sleep, in the hopes that that would keep her from scratching. Sandy was resigned and just nodded and thanked Dr. Baker for his help. And then that day, she began the sleepy medication, but the next morning, she still woke up to find blood on her pillow. The medication was not stopping her from scratching while she slept. A few weeks later, a neurologist named Mary Evans stood over Sandy in her hospital room, carefully examining her wound. Dr. Evans treated diseases of the nervous system, including the brain and spinal cord. Dr. Evans knew that the hospital had already given Sandy a psychiatric evaluation and concluded that her unbearable itch was a sign of mental illness. But she also knew that the evidence they'd collected so far from family and friends made it seem very unlikely that Sandy had OCD. So the psychiatric team had called Dr. Evans from neurology to consult on Sandy's case. Dr. Evans inspected the graft over Sandy's head wound. It seemed to be healing okay. Dr. Evans took out a small aerosol can with a long red tube attached and sprayed a sharp blast of cold air onto Sandy's wound. She asked Sandy if that felt cold, but Sandy just shook her head and said no. She said she could tell that Dr. Evans had sprayed her with something, but could not feel the temperature shift. She also couldn't feel Dr. Evans' fingertips while she was patting the wound. Dr. Evans was puzzled. Sandy couldn't feel any physical sensation when someone touched her wound, and yet the wound was itchy to her. That shouldn't be possible, Dr. Evans thought, except that the doctor had actually seen this in another shingles patient a while ago. That patient was tormented by an insatiable itch over her eye. It was so bad that that patient actually scratched off her own eyebrow. Dr. Evans told Sandy that she didn't actually think she had OCD. and so she wanted to try a few other treatment options. At this point, Dr. Evans could tell that Sandy was both exhausted and deeply discouraged. She seemed desperate to relieve the itch, but also tired of being poked and prodded, and so Dr. Evans promised that these treatments would be virtually painless. Dr. Evans grabbed a syringe of local anesthetic from a metal tray near Sandy's bedside. She injected a few drops to the area around Sandy's scalp to make it numb. Within a few minutes, Sandy's eyes went wide and she grinned from ear to ear. She said the itch was gone, just like when she'd gotten out of her first skin graft. Sandy looked so happy, she seemed like she might cry. Dr. Evans returned her smile. She suspected that Sandy's itch was a physical problem, not a psychiatric one. And this little test confirmed her theory. She warned Sandy that the itch would return as soon as the anesthetic wore off. At that point, they could try an anesthetic patch, but the effects of that wouldn't last very long either. Dr. Evans wanted to try and learn more by taking a sample of the itchy skin. Hopefully, she'd be able to solve this problem once and for all. A few days later, Sandy sat up in her hospital bed, going over her biopsy results with Dr. Evans. They showed that 96% of the nerve fibers in Sandy's itchy skin patch had been destroyed. That meant Sandy shouldn't be able to feel anything around the itchy spot on her scalp. And yet, her itch was as intense as ever. And so Dr. Evans told Sandy that she was going to call a neurosurgeon to get a second opinion. A few hours later, that neurosurgeon came into Sandy's room with Dr. Evans by his side. The neurosurgeon suggested that something must have gone haywire in Sandy's nervous system, causing her to feel a phantom itch in a part of her scalp where there were virtually no nerve cells. The neurosurgeon hoped that if they cut the main sensory nerve connecting the front of Sandy's scalp to her brain, the itching sensation would go away. But Dr. Evans didn't look so sure. She worried that if they went forward with that surgery, Sandy would lose more feeling in her scalp, but potentially still have the itch. Sandy understood that this surgery was risky, but she was desperate. She told both doctors that she needed some time to think about it. And for the next 6 hours, that was all she did. She laid in bed, staring at the ceiling, weighing out her options, while simultaneously doing her best to ignore the constant, incessant itch. Sandy thought about what life would be like if she had no more feeling in a large part of her scalp and forehead, and it made her want to cry. But at the same time, she was so frustrated with this whole situation, she was going mad. It took everything, every minute of every day, to keep herself from scratching and scratching until she tore the nerve right out herself. She couldn't keep living like this. She was scared and nervous, but more than anything, she was just tired and done with this itch. And so if there was even the slightest chance that cutting that nerve would stop the itch for good, Sandy was willing to try it. A few weeks later, Sandy stood over the sink in her hospital room, getting ready for bed. After washing her face and brushing her teeth, she grabbed a bulky foam football helmet from her bedside table and put it around the gauze that was still wrapped around her head. Sandy had to wear this helmet, otherwise, she would rub her head against the pillows while she slept in an effort to scratch her scalp. She climbed into bed, and a few minutes later, a nurse came in and slipped Sandy's wrists into the padded cuffs that were now attached to rails on her bed. After she was restrained, Sandy closed her eyes, trying to get some sleep. For 2 blissful weeks following Sandy's surgery, the itch had been gone. And then it returned with a vengeance. And this time, no amount of pain medications or psychiatric suggestions could get it to subside. Even local anesthetic had stopped working. It was absolutely miserable. Sandy felt awful all the time and was depressed and felt so far from recovery. Now, the only way she could keep herself from scratching her scalp at night was to have the nurses literally bind her wrists to her bed rails. But she hated being awake 24/7 even more. She broke down crying in frustration all the time. She could hear herself growing irritable and snapping at people who didn't deserve it. She was mad at herself for her behavior, but she also just felt totally overwhelmed by the stupid itch and the thought that she might never ever be free from it. Sandy began to wonder if her first doctor had been right, that all of this was just a symptom of OCD. Maybe with the right OCD treatment, her itch would go away again. It was her last hope, because she knew she simply couldn't live another 30 or 40 years with an incessant itch driving her mad. She simply couldn't do it. Sandy began to sob. She'd been to rehab years ago to kick her heroin habit, and that experience had totally changed her life for the better. And so she decided that when she woke up in the morning, she would check herself into a different kind of hospital, a rehab hospital for psychiatric illnesses. 9 years later, in 2008, Sandy heard her doorbell ring. She slowly crossed the living room of her small apartment in Boston and checked her hair in the tiny mirror next to her front door. She opened the door and greeted her guest, a doctor and popular medical writer named Atul Gawande. Dr. Gawande was writing an article for the New Yorker magazine on the physiology of itching and was interested in Sandy's case. And when he'd called her a few weeks ago, she said she was happy to talk about it. It had been 7 years since Sandy left the locked mental ward at a Boston rehabilitation hospital. She'd spent a staggering 2 years in rehab because she was considered a danger to herself. For a while, just like at the previous hospital, they had bound her hands to her bed every night to keep her from scratching at her scalp in her sleep. It had taken months to work out a more humane system. Sandy wore her helmet to bed, along with big white mitts that the staff would fasten to her wrists. It made her feel like Toad from Super Mario Bros. But Sandy certainly did not feel at all like a video game character. The repeated injury to her brain from scratching had left her partially paralyzed, so she was confined to a wheelchair. Sandy led Dr. Gawande into the living room. He took a seat on the couch, and Sandy rolled her wheelchair right next to him, and then Dr. Gawande pulled out a tape recorder and a notebook for the interview that they'd scheduled. As they began talking, Sandy told him that even right now, her itch was bothering her, but she was coping. She found ways to distract herself, like watching her favorite TV shows and keeping up with friends over the phone. Sandy then held up one of her hands to show the doctor how short she kept her fingernails. She told him she did this so that if she did scratch her scalp during her sleep, the short nails would hopefully limit the damage. And then during the daytime, if the itch ever got really bad, she would rub it instead of scratching it, or use a soft toothbrush or towel. At this point, she said she wasn't trying to cure it, she was just trying to find a way to live with it. At the end of the interview, Dr. Gawande thanked Sandy for her candor and promised he would be in touch. He had some ideas about Sandy's condition, but he wasn't quite ready to share them. When he finally published his article, though, his theory about what was going on with Sandy was unlike anything any of Sandy's doctors had ever proposed. In Dr. Gawande's article, he suggested that Sandy's itch might be caused by a little-known condition called sensor syndrome. It's similar to phantom pain experienced by some people who have lost limbs to disease or war injuries. Just like an amputee who feels pain in a part of the limb that was removed, Dr. Gawande wondered if maybe Sandy's brain was telling her she had this itch, even though there were literally no nerves there for her to scratch. In the article, Dr. Gawande described a therapy developed by one of his colleagues to help people with this kind of problem, really specifically people who had phantom pain. The colleague, a neuroscientist, used mirrors to trick his patients' brains into resetting their sensory systems. By angling a mirror a certain way, the reflection could make it look like their missing limb was actually still there, which helped the patients rewire the way their brains processed information. In other words, the mirrors made their brains see what they needed to see to think that their arms and legs were fine. Dr. Gawande thought a similar concept could help Sandy. After speaking to Sandy and gauging her interest in potentially trying this therapy, Dr. Gawande called his colleague who did mirror therapy, and the colleague agreed that Dr. Gawande might be onto something. He suggested that maybe a pair of mirrors could be arranged in a way where Sandy's reflection wasn't reversed, so that left is right and right is left, like it is in a normal reflection. That way, when she looked into this particular mirror, the itchy side of Sandy's head wouldn't itch at all, signaling to her brain to stop scratching there. And then theoretically, over time, the itch would eventually go away. But critically, for this therapy to work, Sandy would have to know she was doing, quote, mirror therapy, but wouldn't know that the mirror was reversed. She would think it was a normal mirror. That's the only way you could actually trick her brain. Dr. Gawande's article about Sandy and the physiology of itching was published in the New Yorker and has since been reprinted over and over giving new hope to people who suffer from this wildly frustrating condition. It's prompted many doctors to rethink the way they treat chronic itching, one of the most common symptoms in all of medicine. Unfortunately, we don't actually know whether Sandy tried mirror treatment because Dr. Gwande never found out. And so as a result, we actually don't know if she still has the itch or if it's gone away. We don't know. However, what we do know, which stems from this article and Dr. Gwande's research, is that other people who have had very similar symptoms to Sandy, these sort of chronic phantom itches, if you will, have been cured through mirror treatment. On September 7th, 2000, Frank Rodriguez lay on the couch in his Montebello, California home, staring off blankly into space as the TV news described the latest traffic jam on the freeway. It was a warm morning in Southern California, but Frank felt cold even though he was underneath a blanket. And he felt so nauseous that every half hour or so, he'd have to get up and run to the bathroom to throw up. Frank, a 41-year-old teacher, had not felt like his normal, energetic self for 2 days. Not since he agreed to help chaperone a field trip at the school where he used to work. The trip had turned into a 15-hour marathon, and he had come home feeling totally tired and groggy. And by the next day, Frank felt too lousy to stay at work at his current job with the Los Angeles Public School District, so he came home a few hours early. Now, Frank's new wife, Angelina, was really getting worried. Frank was a lean, fit man, known for his firm handshake, and he rarely got sick at all. But on this morning, Frank could barely stand up. Angie tried to get Frank an appointment at a nearby clinic, but they said he was too sick for them. So she drove them to a hospital emergency room across town where the waiting area was totally packed. By the time a doctor could actually see Frank almost 5 hours later, he was feverish and shaking uncontrollably, but the doctor was reassuring. He said Frank was suffering from some kind of food poisoning and he just needed to rest and stay hydrated. He wrote Frank a prescription to help him with the nausea and diarrhea and told him to drink plenty of Gatorade. The doctor said this fruity sports drink is actually even better than water when someone has thrown up a lot. On the way home, Angie stopped to buy Gatorade, and then also she stopped to pick up her 10-year-old daughter, Autumn, from school. Autumn was not Frank's biological daughter, but Frank totally adored the little girl, and his face lit up when she jumped into the back seat. As soon as she sat down, Autumn asked Frank how he was feeling, and even though Frank was leaning up against the window, kind of barely able to move, he kind of turned his head and smiled at her and said, "You know what? I'm doing a lot better now." Angie planned to play nurse for her ailing husband for the day, making chicken soup and hot tea and making sure he drank plenty of Gatorade. Autumn said she would help too. When the family got home, Angie and Autumn headed for the kitchen, but Frank called them back to the living room. Instead of lying down, Frank dropped down to one knee in the middle of the room, and he reached out both his hands for theirs. Once they were all holding hands, they formed a small circle, and then Frank closed his eyes and began to pray out loud. He talked about how much the Lord had blessed him when he found them, giving him a second chance at happiness. He felt awful right now, Frank admitted, but he was still very thankful for the happy life they all shared together. Frank prayed a lot. He was a deeply religious man who often carried a Bible with him and went to the local Pentecostal church for Wednesday prayer groups as well as Sunday services. But Frank wasn't preachy. Instead, he was a very calming presence who listened well and tried to do the right thing. The students that he taught and counseled, many of them very deeply troubled, adored Frank because he didn't judge them. There was a lot of truth in Frank's prayer when he talked about getting a second chance. He had married young while he was in the Navy, but the long separations from his wife while he was out at sea had put the couple on the road to divorce. For years after their breakup, Frank bounced from job to job, from plumber to paralegal. He never stuck with anything or anyone for too long, and he often turned to alcohol for comfort. He would be the first to admit that it was a very lonely life. Then Frank found a job as a counselor at Angel Gate Academy, an intensive boot camp for troubled teenagers on the grounds of an old National Guard base almost 200 miles north of Los Angeles. It was a place full of unhappy adolescents who were required to live for 4 weeks at a time in the barracks under military-style discipline. The school could be a really tough place to work and tended to attract teachers who had been through traumas themselves. But Angel Gate made Frank feel like he was making a difference in young lives. In fact, he loved it so much that he went back to school to get a degree in counseling, and he gave up drinking almost entirely. Even after he stopped working at Angelgate, Frank had agreed to help chaperone that school field trip. That was when he had started to feel sick. A big part of the reason Frank loved Angelgate so much was because of who he met there in February of 2020. Angie, who worked in administration at Angelgate. Angie was beautiful with dark skin, jet black hair, and a sparkle in her eye that just drew men's attention. But she was also very spiritual. She went to church on Sundays and embraced Jesus as her savior. When Frank suggested that they hold off on having sex until they got married, Angie agreed. Frank thought the two seemed made for each other. Angie, who was 32 years old, was also looking for another chance at love. She had been through a divorce from Autumn's father a decade earlier, and she was just tired of being alone. She was also tired of struggling financially. She had grown up poor in a New York City housing project and spent much of her adulthood looking for a more secure life, with limited success. But with Frank, who was solid, hardworking, and loyal, Angie felt like she had finally found that more secure life. And so, within just 2 months of meeting each other, Frank and Angie got married, and together with Autumn, they became a family. Right after the wedding, Frank accepted a new job teaching middle school in the Los Angeles Unified School District, and that summer, the fledgling family packed up and relocated to a pleasant ranch-style home in the Los Angeles suburb of Montebello. In little more than 6 months, Angie and Frank had changed everything about their lives. They had a new marriage, a new home, a new city, and a new career practically all at once. And they talked all the time about how bright their future looked together. Frank opened his eyes after he said amen to finish his prayer, and he let go of Angie and Autumn's hands. Then he shuffled over to the couch, where he plopped down, and Angie wrapped him in a blanket. And then for the rest of the day, Frank alternated between bowls of chicken soup, glasses of Gatorade, and cups of tea that Angie and Autumn would bring to him. By 9 p.m., Frank still felt terrible, but he was determined to try to sleep it off and hopefully feel better in time for the weekend. And so he kissed Angie and Autumn goodnight, and then he went off to bed. After Frank had left for the bedroom, Angie thought about joining him right then because she was tired too, but one of her favorite shows came on at 10 p.m., Law & Order Special Victims Unit, so she stayed up. She lost herself in the program, confident that she had done everything she could to help her husband get well. As Angie lay on the couch watching her show, she began thinking to herself that she actually really didn't want to sleep in the same bed as her husband that night. She loved him, but she knew he'd be getting up over and over again to go to the bathroom, waking her up every time. And if she just stayed on the couch after her show, she'd be able to sleep. And she'd still be nearby if there was an emergency and had to bring him to the hospital. So, as the closing credits rolled on Law & Order, Angie decided she would stay right there on the couch, and so she shut her eyes and drifted off to sleep. But at around 3 a.m., Angie woke up and decided it was time to go to the bedroom, so she stood up and she began walking in that direction, and then when she went into the bedroom, she saw Frank was not in the bed. At first, she thought he must be in the bathroom, but when she looked, she saw the bathroom light was off, and when she opened the door, Frank wasn't in there. Confused, Angie walked around the end of their bed, and that's when she saw Frank lying face down on their shag rug. He was wearing a t-shirt as he normally did in bed, and so at first it just seemed like he must have just fallen asleep and maybe rolled off the bed or something. But when Angie yelled Frank's name and pulled on his shoulders, he didn't react. And then when Angie got down close and listened to Frank, she couldn't hear him breathing. Angie ran out of the room and called 911. Paramedics arrived within minutes at the Rodriguez's front door, where they were met by Angie, her eyes red-rimmed and puffy from crying. She frantically led them through the house to the bedroom where her husband was laying, and then when they got down and felt him, they could see he was cold to the touch, and when they checked, he had no pulse. He was dead. But there was no obvious reason why. His body offered few clues. The only injury they could find was a bloody nose, likely from when Frank fell to the ground. Angie told them that Frank had been sick for the past couple of days with food poisoning, but overall, Frank's health was excellent, and he was doing all the right things to get better from this food poisoning. He had no history of drug use, and he certainly had no suicidal tendencies. It seemed like Frank was just a healthy guy who dropped dead for no reason. The team from the coroner's office zipped Frank into a black body bag and wheeled him out to the waiting van that would take him to the lab for an autopsy. As an increasing number of emergency officials tramped in and out of the Rodriguez's house, Angie and her daughter clung to each other, sobbing. And by the time they all left, around 9 a.m., Angie felt like she had answered a million questions about Frank's medical history, his emotional state, and the food poisoning that had sent him to the hospital. She didn't believe for a minute that her husband had died suddenly from food poisoning, but neither the police, paramedics, or the coroner's team had helped Angie understand what else could have killed him. As she dialed Frank's mother to tell her that her son was dead, Angie didn't know what she was going to say. But Frank's mother became so hysterical at the news that Angie couldn't tell her much anyway before the call dissolved into wordless sobbing. A few minutes later, Frank's younger sister, Rebecca, called Angie to get more of the awful details. Rebecca had never known her big brother to even get sick, and she knew he was still fanatical about taking care of himself, and so how could he be dead? But Angie had no answer. Nobody did. But something suddenly occurred to Angie when Rebecca told her over the phone that, everybody loved Frank. And Angie, without really thinking about how insensitive this sounded, she just kind of blurted out, "Not everyone, Rebecca. I mean, there were some people who didn't like him. Maybe this wasn't a natural death. Maybe he was murdered." Then Angie began talking about this one particular teacher at Angel Gate who did not like Frank. Now, Angie did not name this person to Rebecca over the phone, but she was thinking about this guy named Mike Benning. Frank had actually left Angel Gate after a nasty internal controversy involving this teacher, Mike Benning. Frank had blown the whistle on Benning for exposing himself to students as well as groping students. Angie said to Rebecca over the phone that this, quote, sicko, because again, she wasn't using his name, had been allowed to keep his job despite Frank's allegations, but Benning was furious with Frank for making the allegations in the first place. And so Angie thought that it was certainly possible that this sicko finally got his revenge on Frank. But Frank's autopsy, which was performed the same day that Frank died, turned out to be inconclusive. The medical examiner, who had performed 4,000 autopsies before Frank's, checked for signs of strangulation or choking, and he found nothing. He looked for needle marks between Frank's toes that might have indicated he was a closet junkie, and there were none. And blood tests for cocaine, heroin, and even marijuana came back negative as well. The medical examiner would also look for signs of damage to key organs, from his heart to his lungs to his kidneys, and again, everything just appeared normal. The coroner's team then went back to Frank and Angie's house a couple of days later to search for toxic chemicals, thinking that might have killed Frank, but all they could find inside of the house was some ant poison and some insecticides. And when they tested Frank's blood, he was negative for both of those poisons, as well as negative for common poisons like arsenic and cyanide. Frank had been dead for only a few days, but his death was on the way to being classified a medical mystery and put on the shelf to be forgotten. The coroner's office was out of ideas, and the local police had never really shown much interest in the case to begin with. They didn't even send over a detective to ask questions on the night that Frank was found dead. But Angie Rodriguez was not about to let her husband's death be forgotten. A few days after Frank's death, Angie called the Montebello police to voice her frustrations at their total inaction. She told the sergeant who answered the phone that it was high time for them to finally open up an investigation. She said there was no way her husband just suddenly got sick and died. He had to have been murdered. Angie was totally insistent. And day after day, Angie would call back, often speaking to the same sergeant, Greg Wilsey, to demand an investigation. To Sergeant Greg Wilsey, Angie's pleas actually sounded familiar. Angie was grieving a sudden, unexplained loss, and she desperately wanted someone or something to blame. This was something the sergeant saw a fair amount with people who were recently bereaved. Also, the sergeant knew that Angie had been asleep on the couch when her husband died in the bedroom, and so he thought, maybe she also felt guilty about not being there when he was struggling with whatever happened to him, and so maybe that's why she's come up with this far-fetched murder theory to explain everything away. But the more Angie called the police department day after day demanding this investigation, the less she sounded just like some grieving widow. She sounded like someone who really thought this could be a murder. And with every call she made, she got more and more specific about who she really believed should be the primary suspect. Angie explained to Sergeant Wilsey that Frank's sudden decline in health began right after he filled in as a chaperone for that field trip at Angel Gate, where he used to work. Frank had come home from that day trip feeling very weary and worn down, so much so that he had to leave work early the next day. And Frank just never recovered, dying just 4 days after the field trip. Angie told Wilsey that maybe someone at Angel Gate poisoned Frank, and she knew someone who certainly had the motive to do that: Mike Benning. Angie threw out the theory that, perhaps on this field trip, Benning, who wanted a chance to get back at his accuser, put poison maybe in the cookies or the Gatorade that was served to Frank as refreshments during the field trip. And when the sergeant began asking questions, Angie just said, "Look, if you want to understand what happened to my husband, you got to start at Angel Gate Academy." It might seem harsh to accuse some ordinary school teacher of plotting a revenge killing against a former colleague, but as Angie explained to Sergeant Wilsey, Angel Gate was not a normal school. Some of Southern California's most troubled students were ordered to attend this academy for these 4-week stints of intense military-style discipline that was intended to kind of scare them straight. And though Angel Gate could certainly point to plenty of success stories, there were also lots of accusations of brutality swirling around the school. There were stories about students who were forced to eat their own vomit, or who were force-fed large volumes of water. There were stories about teachers calling students terrible names, and there were also allegations of physical abuse. And so after Sergeant Wilsey heard all this context about Angel Gate and how potentially the staff there were inappropriate and even violent, he told Angie that, yeah, it does seem like we do need to launch an investigation into your husband's death and see if it's possible that someone from Angel Gate had something to do with it. But the police department in Montebello was tiny and did not have the resources for a full-blown murder investigation. So they called on the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department to take the lead. And within weeks, Angie was talking regularly with 2 sheriff's deputies who were assigned full-time to the case. Their names were Joe Holmes and Brian Steinwand. And in early October, Angie actually went to the Montebello Police Department to sit down with these 2 detectives. Holmes and Steinwand were at opposite ends of their careers. Steinwand was a young specialist in street gang investigations with 10 years of experience, while Holmes was a nearly 30-year veteran closing in on retirement. But together, they got things done. They had just arrested the suspect in a murder days before Frank's death. Inside of a sterile interview room at the police station, Angie again told Holmes and Steinwand the full story of Frank's life and death and why she thought his death was actually a murder. Angie explained that Frank at one point suspected that someone at Angel Gate Academy had spiked his drink on an earlier occasion, which made him sick, but did not seriously injure him. Frank never figured out who it was, but Angie always suspected it had been Mike Benning, the teacher that Frank had reported for alleged inappropriate relationships with his students. Angie told detectives that she was so nervous about Frank's safety that she begged him not to go back to Angel Gate for the September 3rd field trip. But he'd already promised, and he refused to reconsider. When he got home from that field trip, he had told Angie that his former colleagues had treated him really well, and she was totally relieved. But then, of course, Frank got sick, and that was when Angie thought, he must have been poisoned. The detectives were intrigued, but they pointed out that poison is a pretty generic term that includes thousands of different chemicals. Did Angie have any idea what kind of poison Benning could have potentially used to spike Frank's drink? If they had something more specific, they could ask the medical examiner to test Frank's blood again for it. Unfortunately, there is no single test that can detect all kinds of poison. You basically have to have the type of poison and then test for that type. Frank's death had become a total obsession for Angie. Specifically, she couldn't stop thinking about how he had actually died, and she had been doing all this research about it. She casually told the two detectives that she had been reading about a deadly poison that's actually pretty easy to obtain, hard to detect, and frighteningly effective. The leaves of the oleander tree, which is a red and white bush that grows all over California, contains a poison that's very easy to disguise in food or drink. And so Angie believed that it was totally possible that that was what Benning could have used to kill Frank. The detectives agreed that Angie's suggestion could be right, but it was just speculation. Without evidence, they really could not pursue this as a lead. Holmes and Steinwand walked out of the meeting with Angie with mixed feelings. Angie could be right that maybe Mike Benning had killed Frank and, maybe he used oleander, but it was just totally speculation. At this point, the detectives weren't even sold on the idea that there had been a murder at all. After all, they had no cause of death, and the medical examiner had not even ruled out natural causes yet. And so it just seemed like Angie was really jumping to conclusions, and they couldn't do that. But despite all that, both men agreed on one thing. They needed to talk to Mike Benning. After Angie got back from the meeting, she collapsed onto the couch in her living room, feeling totally emotionally and physically exhausted. She was pleased that the police were now seriously investigating her husband's death, but she was actually a little surprised at how much the two detectives were now leaning on her for help. Didn't they have their own sources of information? Couldn't they have come up with a list of hard-to-detect poisons themselves? She was worried that the sheriff's department had assigned a couple of hillbilly cops to the case who didn't know what they were doing. Angie felt like she had no choice but to stay right on top of Detectives Holmes and Steinwand at every step of their investigation. It was the only way to be sure she got justice for Frank. But despite how Angie felt about them, the two detectives were working the case in their own way. They did their homework on oleander. It was indeed highly toxic and widely available, and so they asked the coroner's office to try to determine whether that could have been what killed Frank. The detectives also started gathering background information on Mike Benning. What was his disciplinary record? Did he have a criminal record? And much more. Then, on October 19th, so 6 weeks after Frank's death, Angie called Holmes with startling news. Angie said she had gotten this frightening phone call that morning from someone who identified themselves only as being one of Frank's former students. The ex-student said that he had spoken directly to Mike Benning about Frank's death, and Benning had seemed really defensive, saying police, quote, "can't pin it on me," end quote. Detective Holmes stopped Angie while he searched for a pen, and then when he had it, he said, "Okay, keep going," and then he started writing down all these notes as Angie continued. Angie said this caller said that police had questioned Benning about Frank's death, but Benning insisted that investigators would never be able to connect the death to him. Angie said she tried to pump the caller for information, but the call quality was poor, and the static kept getting worse and worse, and then just before the call broke off completely, the caller had said, "Ask them about antifreeze." Angie said she called the detectives right away before she even had a chance to check with her cell phone company to try to figure out who had just called her, but she was just so excited about this tip that she wanted to share it immediately. And then Angie wondered aloud to the two detectives if maybe Mike Benning really had killed her husband and used antifreeze to do it. But Detective Holmes was not ready to leap to conclusions the way Angie was. For starters, he wondered how anyone could drink antifreeze without knowing it. Wouldn't it taste horrible and the intended victim would spit it out? Holmes was also curious about who this former student might have been and why they would call Angie instead of the police. And then also, why didn't this caller call back after that first call broke up? Neither Holmes nor Angie could answer either of those questions, And so ultimately, Detective Holmes told Angie that yes, this call was clearly very helpful, and investigators would love to speak with this person, this former student, again if they could. And so he asked Angie to please keep his phone number close to her at all times and to pass it along to this anonymous caller if they happened to reach out again. And Angie said she would. After Holmes hung up with Angie, he immediately briefed Detective Steinwand about the call. Angie's anonymous caller may have handed them their first break in the case. Now they needed to contact the phone company and figure out who made the mysterious call to Angie. Angie was also feeling very excited after she got off the phone with Holmes. She was sure that now the detectives would ask the coroner to conduct a new autopsy and he would be able to test for antifreeze in Frank's blood. She had learned from her research that the main ingredient in antifreeze, which is called ethylene glycol, actually tastes sweet even though it's a deadly poison. As a result, antifreeze is particularly dangerous to animals and children who can't read the warning labels. Angie felt like she had become a junior detective herself, spending hours on the phone with law enforcement and many hours more doing her own research both online and at the library. But if the police were finally able to catch the person who killed her husband, then of course all of it would be worth it. But at a minimum, Angie already felt so proud that she was actively helping to catch her husband's killer. But days passed and then weeks passed, and still the detectives did not call Angie back with any updates. Meanwhile, Angie moved out of the house in Montebello to stay with friends up the coast. Frank had been the main breadwinner in the family, and so money was tight now with him gone. But Angie was actually happier to be living with other adults. The horror and stress of the last few months and having no explanation for her husband's death were a bit easier to manage with other people she could talk to all around. But nothing could have prepared Angie for the call she would receive on December 13th, so 3 months after her husband's death. It was a call from Mike Benning, the man she believed murdered her husband. Angie was at home with Autumn baking Christmas cookies in hopes of somehow creating a little holiday cheer when her cell phone rang and she picked it up. Mike didn't even say hello before he asked her a blunt question. "Why did you tell the police that I poisoned Frank with antifreeze?" Initially, Angie was caught off guard and asked who was calling, even though she knew perfectly well that this had to be Mike. But Mike totally ignored her and pressed on. When would he even have the opportunity to poison Frank, he asked. They hadn't worked together since June. Mike said that Angie's allegations against him were now ruining his reputation, and she owed him an explanation. But at this point, Angie now was just mad, remembering her clashes with Mike over his alleged misconduct when they both worked at Angelgate. She said to Mike that his hostility towards her and to Frank had been totally obvious, and now all the evidence suggested that he had been the one to poison Frank. She told him that he should go talk to detectives, not her. And then Angie hung up. Angie sat there for a second in shock. Then she picked up her phone again and dialed Detective Holmes' number. When he picked up, she excitedly told him that Mike had just called her out of the blue and accused her of spreading false rumors about him being the killer. Angie also said that Mike had even threatened her towards the end of the call when he said, quote, "You just gotta watch your back," end quote. Holmes seemed totally taken aback. He told Angie that just the night before, detectives had informed Mike that he was a suspect in this case, and they had said Mike seemed really nervous when he was told this news. And so Detective Holmes promised Angie that he would tell Mike to make absolutely no further contact with Angie, or he would go directly to jail. And so Holmes just urged Angie to stay calm and patient and allow police to finish the investigation. Holmes didn't tell Angie this, but he had actually already asked the coroner's office to send Frank's blood samples to a state-of-the-art lab in Minnesota that specialized in antifreeze poisoning. If Frank really died from drinking antifreeze, then this lab would be able to prove it. They just had to wait for the lab tests to come back. Finally, on the day before Christmas in 2000, Detective Holmes and Detective Steinwand got the report back from the lab in Minnesota. The moment Holmes saw the envelope on his desk, he immediately grabbed it, tore it open, and pulled out the documents and started to read, and as he did, his eyes grew wide. Frank Rodriguez did indeed have a fatal level of antifreeze in his blood at the time he died. In fact, his body was literally riddled with this toxic chemical. There was antifreeze in his eyes, his heart, and his stomach. Angie had been right. Her husband had been poisoned. And her anonymous caller had been spot on when he suggested that antifreeze could have been the murder weapon. The death of Frank Rodriguez was now officially classified as a murder. Detective Holmes and Steinwand were now very close to cracking the case, but the detectives knew there was still a big weakness in trying to hang the murder on Mike Benning. Did he really have the opportunity to poison Frank? Frank had been a last-minute substitute chaperone on that fateful Angel Gate field trip, and so how would Mike have known that Frank was going to be on the trip so he could bring along his antifreeze? Because Mike certainly wouldn't be carrying antifreeze with him at all times. So the detectives turned one more time to Angie for help in late January of 2001. Detective Holmes called her up at home and he asked her if she had a memo or any other written evidence that actually listed Frank as a chaperone for this trip before the trip actually happened on September 5th. This time, Angie had nothing but her memory to go on. Angie said there definitely was a list that had all the chaperones, which included both Frank and Mike on it, and she had seen that at least several days before the trip happened, but when she looked around her house, she couldn't find it. But 2 weeks later, on February 5th, 2001, detectives caught one more big break. The fax machine in the LA County Homicide Bureau came to life in the middle of the afternoon and spit out an anonymous fax. The fax, marked urgent, was addressed to Detective Holmes, and on it, on the first page, was just a simple question: why is Mike still free? And then all the other pages in this fax showed that there had been a faculty orientation for the Angel Gate field trip almost 2 weeks before the event. And Frank's name, circled, was on the list of chaperones. In other words, Mike had plenty of advance notice that Frank would be coming on this trip, and so he would have plenty of time to obtain some antifreeze and mix it in with Frank's drink and cookies. This final piece of evidence was all the detectives needed to make their case against Mike Benning. Two days later, Detective Holmes and Steinwand were driving when Angie paged Holmes. Holmes immediately called her back and told her about the mysterious fax they got. It was the final piece of the puzzle, making it clear that in addition to having a motive, Mike also had the opportunity to murder Frank. Holmes said that they were on their way to arrest Mike in San Luis Obispo, and they'd be happy to pick up Angie if she wanted to be present at the big moment. Angie was thrilled and said yes, she'd love to go. A few minutes later, the two detectives arrived at the door of the house where Angie was staying with friends, and she immediately let them in very eagerly, but Holmes's expression was not what Angie expected. This was a moment of triumph for all of them, and she thought he'd be high-fiving her and thanking her for her help in cracking this case. Instead, Holmes's face was stern, cold even, and he made no attempt at conversation. Instead, Holmes walked over to Angie's purse that was sitting on a side table and he looked inside of it, and then he looked over at his partner and he nodded. Inside the purse were a few sheets of paper, just like Holmes expected there to be. And the contents of those papers would change everything about this case. Here's what detectives say really happened to Frank on the night of September 7th, 2000. To begin with, Angelina Rodriguez was not the lonely, virtuous woman her husband thought she was. She was far from it. She had been divorced 3 times previously, not once, as Frank believed, and she began an affair with a former prison inmate a few months after she married Frank. Friends of Frank say that Angie's devotion to Jesus was just an act to lure him in. Her previous boyfriend had been more of a cowboy, and so she had morphed into this cowboy hat-wearing party girl doing the Texas two-step at country bars. Angie told friends that she never loved Frank and that she saw him mainly as a source of cash. In July of 2000, 2 months before Frank's death, she convinced Frank to take out a $250,000 life insurance policy. If Frank died, Angie would get the financial security she had been dreaming of. Within days of applying for Frank's life insurance, Angie told a friend that she was unhappy in her marriage. But when the friend asked her why she didn't just get a divorce, Angie said she'd get more money from the insurance if she killed her husband. The friend took it as a joke and suggested that Angie try oleander leaves brewed in tea. Angie had never heard of oleander poisoning, but as it turned out, she had an oleander bush right outside of her home. A few days later, in July of 2000, another friend of Angie's suggested killing a nuisance dog by feeding the animal hot dogs soaked in antifreeze. Angie asked, why antifreeze? And the friend said, well, because it tastes sweet, and so the animal will eat it, but it will also kill them, and no one will know. And so Angie took note. And by early September, Angie was ready to put her life insurance scam into action. First, she gave Frank tea brewed with oleander leaves, which made him incredibly ill, but didn't kill him, much to her annoyance. The emergency room doctor had said that Frank had symptoms of food poisoning, but it was probably Angie's toxic tea that was making him ill. And then when they got home from the ER visit, when Angie promised to nurse her husband back to health, what she really was doing was just finishing her crime. The Gatorade that she was giving her husband every 4 hours to keep him hydrated likely contained toxic antifreeze that left Frank dead on the bedroom floor within 24 hours. Angie called her life insurance representative the same day that her husband died to find out about collecting on her husband's policy. And that's when she hit a serious obstacle. The salesman said Angie could not collect on the policy until the medical examiner determines the cause of death. As a result, when the autopsy came back inconclusive, Angie was not able to get her $250,000. Desperate for this money, Angie began badgering the Montebello police to open a murder investigation, and then she began feeding them clues to solve a crime that she herself had committed. All the time that Angie thought she was providing key information for this investigation, the two detectives that she called hillbilly cops had been one step ahead of her. Holmes and Steinwand had been working with Mike Benning for months. They quickly discovered that Frank had never been a whistleblower. He had never reported Mike for sexual misconduct with students, and Mike also said he considered himself a friend of Frank. Angie was the one who had repeatedly accused Mike of misconduct, but no one at the school believed it. As a result, Holmes and Steinwand knew that Mike had no reason to want Frank Rodriguez dead. But someone else had a powerful motive to murder Frank Rodriguez. The detectives just needed proof that their theory was right, and they used Angelina Rodriguez's own greed to lure her into a trap. But Angie just thought the detectives were slow, so she kept giving them new leads, eventually revealing the two poisons she had used, and creating a trail of lies in an effort to blame someone else. On the night in February of 2001 that Mike confronted Angie about her allegations, the detectives were listening to that phone call. They knew he never threatened Angie and that she lied about much of their conversation. But Angelina Rodriguez was genuinely surprised at what happened when Holmes and Steinwand came to her door that day in February of 2001. She really believed the detectives were coming over to her house to drive her out so she could watch Mike Benning get arrested. Instead, Detective Holmes pulled out a pair of handcuffs and slapped them on her wrists and said, "You are under arrest for the murder of your husband." Just before he arrested her, Detective Holmes had opened Angie's purse, and like he expected, he found the original of the anonymous fax that had given the detectives that last bit of evidence they needed to arrest Mike. Angie was the anonymous faxer. Disturbingly enough, the detectives believed that this was not the first time that Angelina Rodriguez killed for money. Her daughter, Autumn, actually had a younger sister named Alicia, who died at the age of 1 in 1993 from choking on a broken pacifier. At the time, no one suspected foul play, but after Frank's murder, investigators reviewed that case, and they discovered that the child did indeed choke on a pacifier, but there was evidence that someone forced it down the child's throat. At the time, Angie had a $50,000 life insurance policy on the baby, and after the baby died, Angie successfully sued the pacifier maker for a wrongful death. Angie never collected the life insurance money for her husband, Frank. Instead, she was convicted of aggravated murder and sentenced to death. 2 decades later, and Angelina Rodriguez is still on death row awaiting execution. As of recently, she insists that she is innocent and that her husband Frank just killed himself when he found out that she wanted a divorce. Also, just as a closing remark, Mike Benning is a pseudonym. We did not use his real name in order to protect his reputation. No matter whether you believe this tragedy is the result of something paranormal or something normal and rational and explainable, no matter which way you feel, or maybe somewhere in the middle, the details of the story itself, the actual facts of the story, are horrifying. What actually happened to this poor family in the 1920s it's just one of the more terrifying ordeals that I've ever come across, and it's crazy to me that it's a true story. Without giving too much away, someone or something shows up on this farm and it doesn't leave. One of the maids starts hearing strange sounds. They start looking for this person or this thing. They start seeing things moving around in their house, and there's every indication that someone is in the farm. Someone has snuck into the farm and is terrorizing us. And then on March 31st, 1922, whatever it was, finally attacks. This is the story of the Hinterkaifeck murders. Before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the dark, strange, and mysterious delivered in story format, well then my channel is the one for you. That is literally all I do on this channel, and I upload 3 to 4 times every week. So if that is of interest to you, I would ask you to gently 360 no-scope the like button, subscribe, and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. All right, let's dive in. Back in the 1920s, there was a farmstead called Hinterkaifeck Farm that was located in southern Germany in a very rural, isolated, heavily forested area. So the occupants of the farm were the live-in maid and the Gruber family. The Gruber family was Andreas, his wife Azelia, their daughter Victoria, and Victoria's 2 children, Joseph and Azelia as well. And everything was going fine for the Gruber family and for their farm until the winter of 1921, when some very strange things started happening on their property. The first one to notice strange things happening around their property was their live-in maid. She spent the majority of her time in the main house, and she was alone a lot of the time. And she started to notice when she was alone that she would hear tapping, what sounded like in the walls. Not someone in another room tapping, but literally something in the walls. And she would go up and she would listen, and it would still be tapping, but she couldn't make sense of it. And then she started hearing a combination of disembodied voices and footsteps in the attic. And when she started hearing those footsteps and voices coming from the attic, she ran and told Andreas to say, hey, someone's in your attic. Andreas would go up. Even though he was skeptical, he'd go up to the attic and he would look, and not only is no one there, but it was this totally open space up there. There wasn't really anywhere to hide. There was no one up there, and there was no sign of anybody having been up there. There was no food, there was nothing. And so over the course of several weeks, the live-in maid kept saying that at night she'd be laying in bed and she would hear footsteps and voices from the attic. She'd hear tapping in the walls. She would tell Andreas, and then Andreas, he'd be frustrated with her because he didn't really believe her, and he'd go charging up into the attic and nothing would be there. And so she was just not having it. She'd been working with this family for a long time. She did not feel convinced that no one was there. She really thought this place was haunted. And so she ultimately tells the Gruber family, like, I'm sorry, but I can't stay here another night. Whenever I'm here, I feel like I'm being watched. And at night, I can't sleep because of the footsteps in the attic and these voices. I know you've checked, but I can't be here anymore. And so she quits. And it really catches the Gruber family by surprise because they rely on her help. And so they're kind of thrown for a loop because they have to replace her. And so she leaves, and now they need to go find a replacement. Over the following 6 months, they would not find a replacement, and it would create an increased workload for basically everybody on the farm, which led to a higher stress level. Everybody's kind of on edge. The departure of the live-in maid was a really big deal. And so you got to put that in perspective as you hear what happens over the next 6 months. At first, after the live-in maid had left, no one reported hearing any strange sounds around the house. They were so busy that they didn't even have time to consider if there was any sounds in the house that they didn't recognize. But eventually, Andreas would later admit that he started hearing the tapping sounds and the footsteps in the attic and the disembodied voices, and no one's there. And so now he's becoming paranoid, and he shared his paranoia with the rest of the family, who's now also hearing these sounds and these disembodied voices and the footsteps, and despite checking and now searching the whole property. They've begun to actually do a full-blown investigation. Everyone's just stressed. They don't know what it's coming from. They're mad at each other for becoming paranoid. And so they just continue on with work and try to put it out of their mind that they're hearing these strange sounds. But the activity in the house would only intensify. What was initially just strange tapping sounds and what they thought were disembodied voices turned into things going missing around the house. Most notably, a set of their house keys went missing. And there's only so many people there. There's really not a good answer as to why they might go missing, and they only have a couple sets. It's a big deal to lose a set of keys, and they went missing and they couldn't find them. Once the keys went missing, the family couldn't stop thinking about the strange sounds in their house and wondering if there really was someone hiding in their house. And it was terrifying. And then when young Azalea, one of the grandchildren, suddenly went missing one night, the whole family is in full panic. They go out looking everywhere for her. They're yelling in the forest. They can't find her. And then finally they find her, and she has no idea how she got out, where she went, and what even happened. She just was like, I don't know why I'm here. I don't know how I got out. She was exhausted. She was confused. They brought her back to the house, and they're trying to get her to explain why you were doing that, and she can't. They go back inside, and sitting on the table is a newspaper that Andreas didn't subscribe to. No one in the family had brought. No one even in the area, it would turn out, subscribed to this particular kind of obscure newspaper, and it's just sitting in their house. A couple days after that, they noticed that someone had clearly tried to break into their tool shed, which had loads of tools in there, very expensive. There was a lock on the outside, and there was very deep gashes into the metal. It looked like someone had been, hacking away at the lock to try to break it open. But they're living in a very isolated part of Germany where there isn't much ambient sound, and so it was strange to them that someone had been so violent with this lock, hacking at this metal lock, presumably with something metal, and no one had heard it or reacted to it. None of the dogs had heard it, nothing. So just very confusing stuff is starting to happen around the property. But it would be what Andreas sees in the spring of 1922 that pushes he and his family over the edge from general paranoia to outright panic. So Andreas wakes up in early March of 1922. There was this huge snowstorm the night before. He gets up early and he goes to the back door of his house and he opens it up, and he can clearly see that there are footprints that have walked from the forest, which is pretty far away from his property. They have quite a bit of acreage. There's footsteps that are clearly coming out of the forest all the way up to the door that he has now just opened. And he's looking down at these footprints, and there's no return set of tracks. And so he's thinking to himself, well, whoever walked up to my house came into the house. So he shuts the door and locks it and immediately goes and wakes up his family and says, hey, why are there footprints leading up to the back door? Because there's no footprints going away. Someone came to the back door and apparently came inside. His wife, his daughter, the grandkids, no one has a clue. The maid, nobody knows. They say, hey, we've been asleep. We have no idea. So now Andreas, he's obviously thinking about the strangeness that's happened in his house over the past couple of months. And so he's worried. So he opens the door back up and he looks and he's studying these footprints and he's like, I just don't get it. You have to turn around and walk back. Otherwise you're here, you're at the house. He shuts the door and he walks around his house. He looks at all of the different exits to his house. So he looks to see if there's exiting footprints, which is scaring him thinking about it, which means someone would have come into the house and jumped out a window or gone out another door, but he's just checking. And as soon as he makes sure there's no other footprints, he does a scan of his entire house. Because now he's convinced that someone's in his house. He goes to the attic. He goes all around. He's yelling. He's looking everywhere. There's nothing. There's no one in the house. The family's concerned, but there's no one in the house. So he keeps everything locked, and he goes outside and he starts tracking these footprints back to where they came from. And he walks all the way to the forest, and they just kind of stop abruptly. Like they just started kind of magically at the edge of the tree line and walked right up to his house, but there's no clear origination besides it's just in the forest somewhere. And there's also no clear sense of what happened once they arrived at the door. So after doing one more loop around his property, he goes in the barn, he goes in the shed, he goes back in his house, he's checking the attic, he's looking everywhere, and he can't find any indication that some stranger is here. He finally decides that he's going to tell someone about what's been happening at his property. And so they did have a neighbor, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, who was his closest neighbor, who was not really that close, but a couple hundred yards away. And he goes over and he tells Lorenz everything. I've been hearing sounds. My maid quit because she was hearing sounds. We looked in the attic. We couldn't find anything. Then we started hearing sounds. The keys go missing. There's this newspaper in my house. My granddaughter's running out in the middle of the night. She's disappearing. She doesn't know what's going on. These footprints. I can't make sense of it. And so Lorenz, also not knowing what to make of it, suggests hey, I have extra weapons. You want to take an extra rifle and arm yourself, protect yourself? And Andreas just says, you know what? No, I'm good. I'm going to pass on the rifle. I'm probably overreacting anyways, and I'm sure we're just fine. But it would turn out he was not just fine, and he probably should have taken up Lorenz on the offer. So just a couple of days after speaking with his neighbor about the weirdness happening on his property, the Gruber family got a little bit of good news, which was they finally were able to locate another maid, a live-in maid, to come stay with them to replace the one who had left because she believed the place was haunted. And so a few weeks later, on March 31st, 1922, this new maid shows up to Hinterkaifeck. But unfortunately, this would also be the same date a horrible tragedy unfolds at the Hinterkaifeck farm. Over the course of 24 hours, someone or something was in the barn on Hinterkaifeck and was able to silently lure in members of the Gruber family one by one. Without telling anybody else what they were doing, they would walk over almost like in a trance into the barn, where they would be struck in the head by something called a mattock, which is kind of like an axe. Blow to the head and they're down. As soon as they're down, whoever was in there, whatever was in there, would take their bodies and move them to the corner and lay them down, kind of square them up against the corner of the barn, and then cover them with hay. And then as soon as they were deceased, he would go, whatever it was, would go back and lure in the next person. So over a whole day, each of these members of the family are being lured into this barn where investigators, nobody knows what it was that was luring them in. They weren't scared when they went in. Their guard was down, and they would go in and then get hit in the head with this mattock until there was 4 people stacked up in the corner. And at that point, the remaining 2 people on the farm were still in the house sleeping, and whoever was doing this went into the house and used the mattock to end their lives as well. 4 days later, on April 4th, a repairman who was scheduled to come to the Hinterkaifeck farm shows up to repair the feeding machine. He goes to the door, he knocks on the door, and it's locked, and he can see lights on inside, he can hear the dog barking inside, but no one comes to greet him. Now, the feeder was outside of the main house, and it was actually on basically a public area of the farm, so he didn't need them to physically get to the feeder, and he knew how to fix it. So after trying the front door, going to the back door, looking in the windows and seeing lights, hearing the dog, but everything's locked, he just said, you know what, I'm just gonna do the job. So he goes into the area where the feeder is, he does the repair, and as he's leaving, he notices that the dog that was barking, that was inside the house, is now outside the house tied up. And so he goes over to that section of the house thinking, oh, well, now I'll knock on the door and someone's sure to see me. And again, no one comes to the door, and the back door that clearly must have just been opened to let the dog out, is locked again. And so he's like, man, that's odd. And so instead of just leaving, he finishes the job with the feeder, and he goes over to Lorenz Schlittenbauer's house, the neighbor, and he says, hey, just so you know, I was just over at the Gruber family's farm. I fixed their feeder like they wanted me to, but no one was there, but maybe somebody was there because the dog was inside, then it was outside. Don't know what's going on, but can you just let them know that I was here because I couldn't get in touch with them. But it prompts Schlittenbauer to go check on the Grubers because they haven't seen him in a couple days anyways, and so they figure they'll swing by and just make sure everything's okay. So they go over to Hinterkaifeck, and the lights are on in the house, the dog sure enough is outside, the doors are locked, and they see that the barn is actually open. So they go over to the barn, and in the barn, at first they don't see anything, but in the back corner underneath some hay are 4 of the bodies of the Gruber family. They go inside and they find the remaining 2 bodies, and no one else is there. although there was signs of someone recently eating in the kitchen. The fire was lit, it was like the house was being lived in at that very moment. Although to Schlittenbauer and anybody that was there, they have no way of knowing that it's been days since the Gruber family had passed away. And so they end up leaving and getting in touch with authorities. So the police show up and they're able to determine with relative certainty that the tragedy took place on March 31st. But for 4 days afterwards, someone lived in the Gruber house, slept in their beds, ate their food, lit fires, lounged around inside, they played with the dog, they milked the cows. I mean, they lived in this house. They ran the farm for 4 days. And other neighbors would even say that, yeah, we saw smoke coming out of the chimney on, April 3rd and April 2nd. And so it was confirmed that someone had been staying in this house, which is so creepy. And so the police are a little bit baffled, and they're like, okay, well then it was probably a drifter. Target of opportunity, they probably saw this isolated farm, and they probably were gonna rob them, stay there a little bit, and then leave. But when they searched the farmhouse, there were large sums of cash that were just out practically in the open, barely hidden, that had not been taken. And anybody that was robbing the place would have taken the cash. And so probably wasn't a robbery, which leaves maybe a crime of passion, but they were like, what's the motive? And unfortunately, Andreas was not particularly well liked in the town that was nearby. And so there was lots of people that didn't like Andreas, which made it really hard to whittle it down. So they started just interviewing like crazy. They're talking to hundreds of people that were in connection with, that could be connected to this, but they're getting nowhere. They did feel like Lorenz Schlittenbauer was probably the best suspect, because he's right there, he's right next door, he's their neighbor. And in fact, he had wanted to marry Victoria, the daughter, and Andreas had told him outright no, and they thought that could be a reason. But the big issue with Lorenz Schlittenbauer being the primary suspect is, he had a farm to keep and a family to take care of. And so how could he have committed this crime and then ran the Hinterkaifeck farm for 4 days and lived there and slept there without his family knowing? And his family's like, no, he's been here with us. And so the police, they aren't able to solve it. They don't really have any decent suspects. And so they kind of leave it with, well, whoever did this probably had been there for about 6 months, potentially, before they committed the crime, and then stayed there for a few days afterwards and then vanished. And to this day, they have not been caught. And they even reopened this case in 2007. But they found that, despite the number of suspects and despite the evidence available, it just wasn't enough to provide any sort of clarity on what actually happened. So it remains a huge mystery. So like any other high-profile unsolved mystery, there are literally hundreds of potential explanations for what could have happened. But what I'm most interested in is what you all think could have happened. I will do my best to look through your comments, and I'll respond to the ones that are the most interesting or the most plausible. So please, if you would, in the comment section, let me know what you think happened at Hinterkaifeck. And if you haven't already, please gently 360 no scope the like button, and then please also subscribe and turn on all notifications so you get more content just like this in the days to follow. That's gonna do it, guys. I hope this was interesting. If you want to get in touch with me, you can reach out to me on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallen416. And I'm also very active on TikTok. My handle is MrBallen there as well. And that's gonna do it, guys, and I will talk to you soon.
From Ballen Studios and Wondery, this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballen. A quick note about our stories. They are all inspired by true events, but we do sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and also some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. And a reminder, The content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment.
This episode was written by Aaron Land. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Matthew Chilelli. Our senior managing producer is Nick Ryan. And our coordinating producer is Taylor Sniffen. Our